He's defective, one of the aliens said with a quiet laugh. Look, his skeleton failed under routine stress. The room answered with polite amusement, the kind reserved for watching something embarrassingly fragile. Daniel Brooks kept his eyes shut for another second, drawing one slow breath before opening them to the bright, white ceiling above. His right arm rested inside a clear stabilization brace, and the dull ache running from his wrist to his shoulder reminded him exactly what had happened. He had slipped during a routine maintenance inspection aboard Horizon Relay Station, caught himself the wrong way, and heard the unmistakable crack before he ever hit the deck. It hurt, more than he wanted to admit. But pain wasn't exactly unfamiliar. "You awake, Mr. Brooks?" asked a soft voice from his left. Daniel turned his head toward the human nurse, Melissa Carter, who offered a careful smile while checking the display floating above his bed. "Yeah," he answered with a dry grin. "Guess I picked a lousy day to miss breakfast." Melissa let out a small laugh before glancing toward the observation gallery above the medical bay. Behind the transparent barrier stood nearly a dozen alien physicians, researchers, and graduate students, quietly studying him as though he were an unusual museum exhibit. Their species rarely suffered broken bones. Their skeletal structures either remained perfectly intact for life or failed catastrophically under trauma. Recovery simply wasn't part of their biology. To them, Daniel represented proof that humans were built badly. A tall physician stepped forward from the observation deck. His translator rendered his voice in calm American English. "Mr. Brooks, I am Dr. Kaler. I appreciate your cooperation." Daniel nodded. "Didn't realize I had much choice." A few of the observers chuckled. Kaler tapped several glowing charts. "Your radius fractured under force levels considered insignificant by Alliance standards. Based on comparative biology, your species demonstrates exceptionally poor structural resilience." Daniel looked down at the brace wrapped around his arm. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "Bones break." More whispers spread through the gallery. They seemed surprised he wasn't offended. Kaler tilted his head. "You acknowledge this defect without protest?" Daniel shrugged with his free shoulder. "Doc, when I was 10 years old, I fell out of an oak tree trying to build the world's worst treehouse. Broke my left arm. At 16, I cracked 2 ribs playing varsity football. My younger brother broke his ankle riding a dirt bike. Stuff happens." Silence replaced the laughter for a moment before another researcher quietly said, "Multiple skeletal failures throughout one lifetime." "Pretty normal where I come from," Daniel replied. "You fix it. You heal. Then you go back to living." One young alien couldn't hide his disbelief. "You voluntarily continue dangerous activities after repeated structural damage." Daniel smiled. "That's kind of how childhood works in America." Melissa shook her head, smiling despite herself. "He's leaving out the part where his mom grounded him for climbing that tree." Daniel sighed dramatically. "I was more upset about losing my bike than the cast." More confused murmurs followed. None of them understood why someone would joke about injury. Kaler studied Daniel's vital signs in silence. Elevated heart rate, stable blood pressure, no panic response, no signs of neurological deterioration. The human appeared comfortable, not because he wasn't hurting, because he expected to recover. Kaler zoomed in on the first cellular scans from Daniel's fractured arm. Tiny biological processes had already begun organizing around the damaged bone. The computer highlighted early repair activity that should not have appeared so quickly. Kaler frowned. He recalibrated the scanner himself. The readings remained unchanged. Below the observation deck, Daniel shifted carefully against the pillow and looked toward Melissa. "Any chance I could get some ice water?" "Absolutely," she said. "And maybe real coffee?" Daniel asked hopefully. Melissa laughed. "Let's get you through today first." As she walked away, Kaler continued staring at the impossible scan. The human had been inside the medical bay for less than 2 hours. According to every accepted model in the Galactic Alliance, his body should have been doing little more than reacting to the injury. Instead, it had already begun rebuilding itself. Dr. Kaler did not sleep that cycle. He remained inside Diagnostic Suite 3 long after the rest of the observation team had rotated out, replaying Daniel Brooks's medical scans frame by frame. Every prediction generated by the Alliance medical database insisted the same outcome should have occurred. The fracture should have remained unstable for several days. Cellular activity should have focused entirely on inflammation before any structural repair could even begin. Yet the software kept highlighting dense clusters of new bone growth forming around the damaged radius far earlier than any accepted biological model allowed. Kaler expanded the image again. Then again. Finally, he disconnected the prediction engine altogether. Run the scan manually, he told his assistant. The younger researcher looked confused. Without the diagnostic algorithms? Without assumptions, Kaler answered quietly. Several minutes later, the manual measurements finished processing. The results matched the automated system almost perfectly. The fracture was already stabilizing. The assistant folded two upper arms across his chest. Perhaps the patient received undisclosed regenerative treatment before arrival. Kaler slowly shook his head. His blood chemistry does not support artificial repair technologies. Then perhaps this individual is genetically unusual. Kaler looked through the observation glass where Daniel sat in bed drinking coffee with his left hand while talking comfortably with Nurse Melissa Carter about baseball. There was no sign of panic, no bitterness, no attempt to exaggerate his discomfort. He simply looked like an ordinary working man recovering from an inconvenient accident. I do not believe he is unusual, Kaler murmured. I believe we are missing something fundamental. Down in the room, Daniel noticed the doctor watching him. He raised the paper coffee cup with a friendly smile. Morning, document. I promise I am not trying to break your equipment. Kaler actually smiled back before entering the room. Mr. Brooks, would you mind answering several additional questions? Depends, Daniel said. Is this the part where I find out I owe somebody a fortune for these scans? Melissa laughed. Trust me, the paperwork is worse than the bill. Kaler tilted his head. You continue displaying humor despite measurable pain. Daniel shrugged. My dad always said you can complain all day, or you can get through the day. Either way, the day keeps moving. Kaler activated his recorder. How many confirmed skeletal fractures have you experienced? Daniel looked toward the ceiling while counting on his fingers. Left arm when I was 10. 2 ribs in high school football. Right ankle during a winter hiking trip in Colorado. Couple of broken fingers working construction before I became an orbital maintenance engineer. Now this arm. The recorder paused automatically, unable to reconcile the statement. Kaler checked the transcript. You returned to physically demanding occupations after each event. Of course. Daniel took another sip of coffee. Kind of hard to pay a mortgage sitting on the couch forever. You never feared permanent structural weakness? Daniel smiled. Sure I did. Every time. But eventually the doctor tells you that you are good to go, and life does not wait around. Kaler remained silent for several seconds. Among his own species, surviving one major skeletal injury usually meant permanent retirement from hazardous work. The psychological impact alone prevented most patients from ever trusting their bodies again. Yet this human described repeated recovery as though it were simply another part of growing up. Melissa finished replacing Daniel's brace padding before glancing at the newest imaging results on the wall display. Even she stopped smiling. The fracture line already appeared thinner than it had just hours earlier. Doctor, she whispered, is that normal? Kaler answered without taking his eyes off the scan. No, another specialist hurried into the room, carrying fresh laboratory reports. Chief Kaler, we repeated every analysis. There is no contamination, no hidden implants, no regenerative nanotechnology. His body is accomplishing this unaided. Kaler slowly lowered the report. For the first time in his 31-year medical career, he realized the Alliance textbooks had not discovered an exception to the rules of biology. They had discovered an entirely different definition of resilience. By the third morning, Horizon Relay Station had quietly stopped treating Daniel Brooks as an ordinary patient. Without anyone making an official announcement, the traffic outside his room changed. Maintenance crews slowed as they passed the observation window. Medical interns volunteered for assignments near Diagnostic Suite 3. Even senior researchers who rarely left their laboratories found reasons to walk by. Nobody wanted to admit it out loud, but everyone was waiting to see whether the impossible would continue. Daniel, meanwhile, was trying to convince Melissa Carter that hospital food somehow tasted worse in space than it did back home. You know what this place needs? He said after taking another bite of oatmeal. Hot sauce. Melissa laughed while adjusting the monitor beside his bed. That is your solution for everything. Pretty much. She shook her head. Your chart says your pain level should still be around a 6. Daniel flexed the fingers of his injured arm inside the brace. Feels more like a 3. Melissa looked at him suspiciously. You are not just saying that because you want to leave sooner? Believe me, Daniel replied. If it still hurt like yesterday, I would tell you. Before Melissa could answer, Dr. Kaler entered carrying a portable imaging unit himself instead of sending another technician. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Morning, document. You look like somebody stole your weekend. Kaler almost smiled. I have not had one in several days. Daniel pointed toward the scanner. More pictures. Yes. Go ahead. Maybe I am becoming photogenic. The device projected a detailed, three-dimensional image of Daniel's forearm into the air above the bed. The room became unusually quiet. Melissa leaned forward first. Then the two research assistants standing near the door exchanged confused looks. Kaler slowly rotated the image with one hand. The fracture line had become dramatically smaller overnight. New bone tissue surrounded the damaged area in neat, organized layers. The stabilization brace was still medically appropriate, but the biological repair underneath had advanced at nearly twice the fastest documented prediction produced only 24 hours earlier. One assistant immediately reached for another scanner. Equipment verification. Kaler nodded. Run it. 5 minutes later, a second imaging system produced nearly identical results. Then a third portable scanner confirmed them again. Nobody spoke until the youngest researcher finally whispered. All three systems agree. Another physician frowned at the display. This should not be possible. Daniel looked back and forth between them. You all keep saying that. Kaler folded his hands behind his back. Because according to everything we understand, this level of regeneration requires considerably more time. Daniel gave a small shrug. Maybe humans are just impatient. A few nervous laughs escaped around the room before fading again. Nobody actually found the answer humorous anymore. Kaler sat beside Daniel's bed for the first time instead of remaining at a professional distance. May I ask something more personal? Sure. When you experienced previous fractures, did your physicians consider your recovery unusual? Daniel thought for a second before shaking his head. Not really. My orthopedic doctor back in Billings always told me to eat well, follow physical therapy, and stop trying to act tougher than I was. Nothing else. No miracle injections. No secret military experiments. Daniel grinned. Just an annoyed doctor who kept telling me to quit climbing ladders. Kaler looked genuinely puzzled. Then your recovery is normal. Far as I know. The doctor stared silently at the floating image again. If Daniel was telling the truth, then millions of humans carried this same biological ability without ever considering it remarkable. The realization unsettled him far more than any abnormal laboratory result. Outside the room, word had already begun spreading through the medical wing. The maintenance engineer from Earth was no longer simply an injured worker. He had become living evidence that an entire civilization had evolved under rules the Galactic Alliance had never bothered to understand. And somewhere deep inside Kaler's disciplined scientific mind, one uncomfortable thought refused to disappear. Perhaps humanity had never been biologically fragile at all. Perhaps the galaxy had simply mistaken recoverable weakness for permanent limitation. Ironically, the only person inside the medical wing who seemed completely unconcerned about the latest scans was Daniel Brooks himself. 2 days after the accident, he had already settled into a comfortable routine. He woke up early, stretched as much as the brace allowed, called his younger brother back in Montana through the station's communication terminal, complained about hospital coffee, and politely thanked every nurse who walked into the room. Life, in his mind, had simply been interrupted for a little while. It had not stopped. Melissa walked in carrying another imaging schedule and found Daniel slowly buttoning a clean flannel shirt over his medical clothing. Trying to escape? She asked with a grin. Not escape, Daniel answered. I just feel more like myself wearing something that is not hospital gray. She looked at him carefully. How is the arm? Daniel gently rotated his shoulder before stopping when the brace resisted. Still stiff. Still sore. But honestly, every morning it feels a little better. Melissa frowned. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Before she could answer, Dr. Kaler entered with 3 additional physicians trailing behind him. Normally, only one doctor would have performed a routine follow-up. Today the room looked more like a conference. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I hope somebody remembered donuts. One of the younger researchers blinked in confusion until Melissa quietly explained that it was a joke. Kaler placed a new scan beside the previous day's image. The difference was obvious even without medical training. Fresh bone tissue continued filling the fracture with remarkable precision. There was almost no unnecessary growth, no sign of instability, and far less inflammation than the Alliance models predicted. "Mr. Brooks," Kaler began, "have you attempted to use the injured arm outside the limitations we prescribed?" Daniel looked almost offended. "Doc, my mother raised me better than that. So you have followed every instruction?" "Every single one." "Well," Daniel smiled sheepishly, "I did carry my coffee mug this morning." Melissa sighed dramatically. "With the injured arm?" "It was not even full." "Daniel." "Half full." Even Kaler let out a quiet laugh before returning to the scans. "Despite your questionable decision-making, your recovery continues to accelerate." Daniel leaned back comfortably. "Good. My supervisor has probably already replaced me with somebody who knows how to stay on a ladder." "You are concerned about returning to work?" "Of course," Daniel answered without hesitation. "I like fixing things. Sitting around is the hard part." Kaler exchanged glances with the physicians behind him. Among Alliance species, patients recovering from skeletal injuries usually required extensive psychological counseling before considering hazardous employment again. Fear often lingered much longer than physical recovery. Yet Daniel spoke about climbing maintenance towers again as though discussing weekend grocery shopping. "Does the accident not trouble you?" Kaler asked. Daniel grew quiet for a moment before answering honestly. "Sure it does. I replayed it in my head about 50 times already. I keep thinking maybe I should have checked my footing one more time." "That part is normal. Then why are you eager to return?" Daniel looked out the station window where cargo ships drifted silently past the docking ring. "Because if you let one bad day decide the rest of your life, eventually you stop living. My dad taught me that after I broke my ankle hiking. He told me healing is not about pretending nothing happened. It is about trusting yourself enough to keep going anyway." The room fell silent. None of the doctors entered that sentence into their medical notes, but every one of them remembered it. They had spent decades studying muscles, bones, and organs. Almost nobody had considered resilience itself as part of a species' biology. Kaler looked once more at Daniel's steadily recovering arm before quietly saving the newest scan to the Central Medical Archive. He had originally believed he was documenting an extraordinary fracture. Now he was beginning to suspect he was documenting something far more important. The human body was healing exactly as nature intended, but it was the human mind that refused to remain broken. Ironically, the biggest argument inside Horizon Relay Station was no longer whether Daniel Brooks would recover. It was how to explain what everyone was already seeing with their own eyes. By the 5th day after his accident, the orthopedic laboratory had become the busiest department on the station. Specialists from 6-member species requested access to Daniel's medical record. Every request was approved by Daniel himself after Kaler patiently explained the paperwork. "If it helps somebody," Daniel said while signing another digital authorization, "go ahead. Just promise me nobody names a disease after me." Melissa laughed. "That is your biggest concern? You ever hear about somebody getting a syndrome named after them? It never ends well." The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The amused smiles Daniel had noticed on his first day had disappeared. They had been replaced by quiet curiosity and genuine respect. Even the researchers who originally dismissed human biology now asked questions instead of making assumptions. Later that afternoon, Kaler invited Daniel into the advanced imaging laboratory instead of bringing another scanner to his room. Daniel walked carefully without assistance, his brace supporting the arm more out of caution than necessity. Through the laboratory windows, dozens of specialists watched in complete silence as the newest scan appeared above the central examination table. A three-dimensional model rotated slowly in the air. The damaged section of Daniel's radius looked remarkably different from the original injury. Fresh bone had formed along clean structural lines, rebuilding the fracture with extraordinary precision. There was almost no excess tissue. The internal density measurements continued increasing with every scan. One elderly researcher adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Increase magnification." The image expanded until individual microscopic structures became visible. Another scientist frowned. "Those alignment patterns are organized." A third physician quietly added, "Not organized. Optimized." Kaler folded his hands while reviewing the measurements. "The remodeling process has already begun." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Remodeling was normally the final stage of skeletal repair in Alliance medicine, not something expected this early. Daniel looked around at the fascinated faces before scratching the back of his neck with his free hand. I have a feeling you all know more about this picture than I do. Kaler glanced toward him. Mr. Brooks, when humans recover from fractures, are they informed of these biological stages? Daniel shook his head. Not really. The doctor usually says something like, eat healthy, do your physical therapy, and do not try to impress anybody for a few months. Several researchers exchanged puzzled looks. Your physicians do not explain the cellular reconstruction. Maybe if you ask. Daniel smiled. Most people are just wondering when they can get back to work or throw a baseball again. The room fell quiet once more. Kaler realized something profound. Humans lived with one of the most adaptable skeletal repair systems documented by the Alliance. Yet most of them treated it as an ordinary inconvenience rather than an extraordinary gift. Their biology had become so familiar that they rarely stopped to admire it. One researcher finally broke the silence. Chief Kaler, should we classify human skeletal regeneration as an advanced evolutionary adaptation? Kaler answered without hesitation. No, everyone looked toward him. He continued, we should classify our previous understanding as incomplete. Daniel smiled politely, not fully appreciating why those words mattered so much. To him, the healing bone inside his arm was simply another step toward getting back to his toolbox, his crew, and the maintenance platform waiting somewhere outside the station. But inside that laboratory, decades of medical doctrine quietly shifted. The aliens had come expecting to document an unusually resilient patient. Instead, they had uncovered an entire species whose bodies had been solving difficult problems for millions of years without ever asking the galaxy for permission. Ironically, the breakthrough that changed Dr. Kaler's thinking forever had nothing to do with another scan. It happened over lunch. Daniel sat at a small table near the observation window, carefully balancing a bowl of soup with one hand while trying to convince Melissa Carter that the station's grilled cheese sandwich would never beat one from a roadside diner in Montana. You have never even been to Montana, Daniel said with a smile. I have also never been inside an active volcano, Melissa replied. Some experiences can remain theoretical. They both laughed just as Kaler approached carrying his own meal tray. The chief physician hesitated for a moment before asking, May I join you? Daniel motioned toward the empty chair. Absolutely. Document, pull up a seat. For a few minutes, they simply ate in comfortable silence. It was the first time Kaler had shared a meal with a patient. Finally, he placed his utensils down. Mr. Brooks, there is something I still struggle to understand. Daniel looked up. Only one thing. Kaler almost smiled. Your body adapts remarkably well. That much is now beyond dispute. But your emotional response appears equally unusual. Most Alliance patients who suffer skeletal injuries develop long-lasting anxiety about repeating the experience. You do not. Daniel leaned back thoughtfully before answering. That does not mean I was never scared. Kaler listened without interrupting. When I broke my ankle hiking in Colorado, I remember lying there thinking I might never climb another mountain again. I hated that feeling. Melissa glanced toward him. She had never heard that story before. So what changed, she asked. Daniel smiled quietly. Physical therapy. Kaler looked confused. The exercises? Not just the exercises. Daniel shook his head. Showing up every week. Taking one more step than I could the week before. Realizing that healing is slow until one day you notice you stop thinking about the injury. Kaler remained silent. Daniel continued. People back home always say time heals everything. That is not exactly true. Time gives you the chance to do the work. The healing comes from showing up. The words lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. One of the younger researchers sitting nearby quietly stopped typing notes and simply listened. Daniel looked toward his recovering arm. Honestly, breaking a bone is not the hardest part. The hardest part is trusting it again. Kaler lowered his eyes toward the brace. Yet humans repeatedly regain that trust. Most of us do. Daniel nodded. Kids fall off bikes. Construction workers throw out their backs. Athletes tear muscles. Ranchers break fingers fixing fences. We complain about it. Then eventually we get back out there. Even knowing it could happen again. Especially knowing it could happen again. Kaler slowly folded his hands together. In Alliance civilization, medicine had always focused on repairing damaged tissue. Human medicine, he was beginning to realize, quietly repaired confidence at the same time. Their rehabilitation programs were not simply rebuilding bodies. They were teaching people how to believe in themselves again. Later that afternoon, Kaler reviewed decades of Alliance rehabilitation protocols. Thousands of pages described bones, joints, muscles, circulation, nutrition, and recovery timelines. Very few discussed hope. Even fewer discussed resilience. He opened Daniel's patient file and added a personal observation outside the standard diagnostic format. Subject demonstrates that psychological recovery appears inseparable from biological recovery in humans. Future studies should evaluate both simultaneously. He read the sentence twice before saving it permanently. Across the room, Daniel finished his soup, thanked Melissa for another refill of coffee, and casually asked when he might be cleared to start light exercise again. Kaler looked at him with quiet admiration. Days earlier, he had believed human resilience was hidden inside the skeleton. Now he understood that the remarkable biology he had been studying answered only half the mystery. The bone was healing because that was what human bodies were designed to do. Daniel was healing because somewhere long before he ever reached the stars, humanity had learned that getting back up was simply part of being human. Ironically, the question that finally changed the conversation across Horizon Relay Station was not how quickly Daniel Brooks was healing. It was whether every human could do the same. The answer arrived sooner than anyone expected. Dr. Kaler requested permission to interview several other human employees stationed throughout the relay. Daniel agreed immediately. "You are going to find out I am the boring one," he joked. "Trust me." Over the next 2 days, maintenance technicians, cargo handlers, engineers, pilots, and security officers quietly visited the medical conference room between shifts. None of them were famous. None had military backgrounds. They were simply ordinary people doing ordinary jobs far from Earth. Kaler began every interview with the same question. "Have you ever broken a bone?" Almost every hand in the room went up. One cargo supervisor laughed. "Fell off a horse when I was 13. A shuttle mechanic grinned. "Broke my wrist trying to impress a girl on a skateboard. It did not work." A woman from Oregon raised her coffee cup. "Soccer game. Freshman year. Best excuse I ever had to skip gym class." Even the station's quiet communications specialist smiled. "My little sister accidentally slammed a car door on my hand when we were kids. She still apologizes every Thanksgiving." The answers filled the room with laughter instead of embarrassment. Kaler listened carefully, waiting for stories about permanent disability or lifelong fear. They almost never came. Instead, every story ended the same way. The cast came off. Physical therapy started. Life moved on. After the interviews, Kaler displayed Daniel's scans beside anonymous medical records volunteered by the other humans. Different ages, different occupations, different injuries. Yet the same biological pattern repeated itself over and over. Controlled inflammation, bone formation, remodeling, recovery. The younger researchers stared at the comparison wall in complete silence. "This is not an anomaly," one finally whispered. "It is a species-wide characteristic." "Correct," Kaler answered. "We mistook familiarity for simplicity." Daniel happened to walk into the laboratory carrying a small paper bag from the station cafe. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Kaler replied. Daniel placed the bag on the table. "I brought cinnamon rolls." Scientific breakthroughs deserve better food than nutrient bars. One of the researchers looked up from the medical charts. "Mr. Brooks, does humanity celebrate recovery?" Daniel blinked. "Celebrate? Yes. Is surviving injury considered culturally significant?" Daniel thought for a moment before smiling. "Not really. We usually celebrate getting back to normal." The room grew quiet again. "Back home," Daniel continued, "when somebody gets their cast off, friends might sign it first. Kids show everybody at school. Parents take a picture. Then you throw the cast away and get on with your life." Kaler looked genuinely puzzled. "You discard physical evidence of recovery?" Daniel laughed. "You cannot keep every cast forever. My mom probably still has one buried in a closet somewhere, but that is about it." Kaler slowly looked around the room at the dozens of scans projected across the laboratory walls. Humanity possessed one of the most resilient skeletal repair systems known to the Alliance. Yet humans treated it with the same casual attitude they reserved for changing a flat tire or repairing a broken fence. Their greatest biological strengths were woven so deeply into everyday life that they hardly noticed them anymore. As Daniel handed out warm cinnamon rolls to doctors, nurses, technicians, and researchers, the atmosphere inside the laboratory quietly transformed. Days earlier, they had gathered to study what they believed was an unusually fragile species. Now they found themselves sharing breakfast with a man who unknowingly represented one of evolution's most remarkable success stories, and the realization settled over the room with surprising humility. The galaxy had spent centuries measuring the strength of human bones. It had never stopped to measure the remarkable certainty with which humans expected those bones to heal. By the end of the second week, Horizon Relay Station no longer viewed Daniel Brooks as a patient. He had quietly become the center of the most significant medical discussion the Alliance had held in decades. Representatives from several member worlds gathered inside the station's medical auditorium to hear Dr. Kaler present his findings. Daniel sat near the back of the room wearing jeans, work boots, and the same blue flannel shirt he had arrived with, his brace now replaced by a much smaller support wrap. He looked less like the subject of a scientific conference and more like someone waiting for a delayed flight home. Kaler stepped onto the presentation platform and allowed the room to settle before speaking. Colleagues, when this investigation began, our objective was to document structural weakness within the human skeletal system. The first slide appeared behind him showing Daniel's initial medical scan from the day of the accident. Several physicians quietly nodded, remembering their original conclusions. Kaler changed to the next image. Then another. The progression spoke louder than any speech could. Each scan revealed steady reconstruction, organized remodeling, and increasing strength. Our first assumption, Kaler continued, was that this recovery represented a rare anomaly. Another slide appeared containing anonymous records from dozens of human volunteers across multiple Alliance facilities. Every graph followed nearly the same pattern. We were incorrect. The room became noticeably quieter. One senior physician raised a hand. Chief Kaler, are you stating that this regenerative capacity is common throughout the human population? Yes. Even among civilians? Yes. Without enhancement technologies? Yes. Kaler paused before adding, our error was not scientific. It was philosophical. We observed that human bones fracture more frequently than many Alliance species and concluded they were biologically inferior. We failed to ask a more important question. What happens afterward? Nobody answered. Kaler looked across the audience before continuing. The defining characteristic of humanity is not that injuries occur. It is that recovery is expected. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly, feeling almost embarrassed that everyone was talking about something he had considered ordinary his entire life. Beside him, Melissa smiled quietly. You all right? She whispered. Daniel nodded. Feels strange hearing somebody make a conference out of stuff my high school football coach used to yell every Friday night. Melissa laughed softly. On the stage, Kaler displayed one final comparison. Alliance rehabilitation guidelines appeared beside standard human orthopedic recommendations. The differences were striking. Human treatment emphasized gradual movement, rebuilding confidence, strengthening weakened muscles, and returning patients to normal life whenever safely possible. Human medicine, Kaler said, does not merely repair tissue. It prepares individuals to trust their bodies again. This distinction may explain why repeated recovery appears psychologically sustainable across their civilization. The auditorium remained silent for several seconds before respectful applause slowly spread through the room. It was not applause for Daniel alone. It was for an entire species that had quietly mastered resilience without ever considering it extraordinary. After the presentation ended, physicians lined up not to inspect Daniel's arm, but simply to shake his hand. One elderly researcher smiled warmly. Mr. Brooks, thank you for your patience with our many questions. Daniel smiled back. Honestly, I thought I was just here because I fell off a maintenance platform. The researcher shook his head gently. No, you reminded us that strength should never be measured by how rarely something breaks. It should be measured by how faithfully it returns. Daniel glanced down at his healing arm before flexing his fingers one more time. The movement felt almost effortless now. For him, it meant he could finally get back to work. For everyone else in that auditorium, it marked the day an old certainty quietly disappeared. From that moment forward, no serious medical textbook in the Galactic Alliance would ever describe humanity as biologically fragile again. On the morning Daniel Brooks was finally cleared to leave the medical wing, Horizon Relay Station felt strangely quieter than usual. The brace was gone. Only a small support sleeve remained around his forearm, more a reminder than a necessity. He rolled his shoulder once, flexed his fingers, and smiled when nothing hurt except a little lingering stiffness. "Looks like you survived us," Melissa Carter said as she handed him the final discharge papers. Daniel laughed. "I was planning on that from the beginning. Most patients leave as quickly as they can." "Nothing personal," Daniel replied with a grin. "But I have been looking forward to sleeping in my own bunk." Melissa nodded. "Fair enough." Dr. Kaler walked into the room carrying a small sealed envelope instead of another scanner. Daniel immediately noticed the difference. "No more tests." "No more tests," Kaler answered. "For the first time since we met, I believe I understand enough to let you simply be yourself again." Daniel accepted the envelope. Inside was not another medical report. It was a printed photograph taken during one of the early scans. Daniel stared at it for a moment before looking back up. "I am not sure why I would frame an X-ray of my arm." Kaler smiled. "That image does not remind me of your injury. It reminds me of my mistake." Daniel looked puzzled. Kaler continued quietly. "When you first arrived, many of us believed your fracture proved that humans were physically fragile. We measured only the moment something failed. We never considered the remarkable determination that followed." Daniel folded the photograph carefully before slipping it into his backpack. "Back home, my grandfather used to say something similar." "What did he say?" "He used to tell me that life is not about never getting knocked down. It is about making sure the ground never convinces you to stay there." Kaler repeated the sentence softly, almost to himself. "The ground never convinces you to stay there." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Kaler extended his hand. Daniel shook it firmly. There was no applause, no ceremony, just two people from different worlds sharing the quiet respect that comes from learning something true. As Daniel walked through the station one final time, workers who had never spoken to him before offered small waves, friendly nods, and warm smiles. The maintenance crew cheered when they saw him carrying his toolbox again. "About time you got back," one coworker joked. "Somebody has to fix the mess you all made while I was gone," Daniel answered. Laughter followed him all the way to docking bay 7. Hours later, after the transport departed, Dr. Kaler stood alone in the observation gallery overlooking the endless stars. His final report had already been transmitted to every major medical institution within the Galactic Alliance. It ended with a single sentence that many would probably remember longer than the scientific data surrounding it. Humanity should never be evaluated at the moment it falls. Humanity should be evaluated by what it chooses to become afterward. Years later, medical students across dozens of worlds would study Daniel Brooks as the patient who quietly corrected an entire civilization's misunderstanding of human biology. Yet if Daniel had ever heard that, he probably would have shrugged, gone back to work, and spent the weekend helping his brother repair a fence somewhere under the wide Montana sky. Because that was the final lesson the galaxy almost missed. Human resilience was never reserved for heroes, soldiers, or legends. It belonged to ordinary people who got up early, did honest work, loved their families, made mistakes, got hurt, healed a little at a time, and kept moving forward anyway. In the end, that was what truly impressed the stars. Not that humans could recover, but that they had quietly built an entire way of life around believing tomorrow was still worth showing up for.